Britain's Cromwell tank entered the European battlefield with a characteristic few in the Wehrmacht expected: genuine, repeatable, battlefield-relevant speed. Not the brief sprint of a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, and not the theoretical top speed manufacturers claimed on paper, but a fast, controlled, highly mobile performance that stunned Panzer crews accustomed to seeing British armor behave very differently in North Africa and early Europe. To Germans who had spent years facing slow, mechanically strained British cruisers or heavy infantry tanks that traded everything for protection, the Cromwell's sudden acceleration, tight turning radius, and ability to reposition before a German gunner could readjust created a tactical shock that rarely appears in most overviews of the Normandy fighting. To understand why this speed mattered, it's important to recognize what British armor doctrine had looked like up to 1944. The pre-Cromwell cruiser tanks, the Crusader, Covenanter, and earlier designs were theoretically fast, but their engines overheated, their suspensions buckled under stress, and their reliability declined sharply outside ideal conditions. German tank officers learned to expect these flaws. A British tank might maneuver quickly, but it could not sustain speed across rough ground, and breakdowns were so common that the German armored forces never looked at British cruisers as true high-mobility threats. This reputation carried into the early war years and became entrenched. The Cromwell broke that expectation at its core. When it finally reached combat readiness, it carried an engine no British tank had possessed before: the Rolls-Royce Meteor, a detuned, tank-adapted version of the legendary Merlin aircraft engine. With it, the Cromwell delivered not a small improvement but a transformation. The Meteor allowed the tank to accelerate faster than almost anything of its weight class on the Western Front. This was not mere engineering enthusiasm. German reports from Normandy frequently noted British tanks moving at speeds unusual for enemy armor, referencing Cromwell units conducting rapid flanking maneuvers or disappearing behind cover before German gunners could traverse. Speed alone, however, is not enough to shock an experienced Panzer crew. What created the impression of unpredictability was the Cromwell's ability to maintain that speed while performing practical battlefield tasks, crossing uneven fields, relocating firing positions, and shifting entire troop formations faster than German units could respond. For Panzer crews trained to fight Allied armor that generally moved in a more deliberate, measured fashion, this sudden appearance of fast, agile British tanks disrupted expectations formed over years of combat. And yet, the Cromwell's blinding speed did not appear out of nowhere. Its arrival was the result of a long, difficult process within British tank development, one shaped by mechanical failures, doctrinal confusion, and the urgency of wartime innovation. To understand how Britain finally put the Meteor engine into a viable battlefield platform, we must look back to the design decisions that led to the Cromwell's creation in the first place. The Cromwell's emergence as a high-speed battlefield tank was not inevitable. In fact, Britain's journey to the Meteor engine was marked by years of mechanical uncertainty and doctrinal contradictions. Before the Cromwell, British tank doctrine divided armor into two rigid categories: slow infantry tanks designed to move with foot soldiers, and fast cruiser tanks intended to exploit breakthroughs. This approach seemed logical on paper, but in practice it created vehicles that excelled at only one narrow purpose. As the war expanded, the limitations of this doctrine became obvious. The early cruisers A-13, Crusader, and Covenanter were built around the idea of speed, but their engines simply could not support the demands placed upon them. Liberty engines, originally designed for aircraft in World War I, were never meant to power 25-ton armored vehicles across rough ground. Overheating, cracked blocks, and fuel delivery failures became so common that crews quickly learned their tanks' reputations for fragility were well-deserved. German units learned it, too. By 1942, Panzer crews viewed British cruisers not as highly mobile threats but as unreliable machines that might fail before they ever reached the engagement line. The decision to replace these engines with something entirely new marked a turning point. Rolls-Royce engineers, already building thousands of Merlin engines for Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Lancasters, proposed adapting the Merlin into a tank engine. The concept was bold. Take one of the world's most advanced aircraft engines, strip out its supercharger, strengthen the lower end, and convert it into a robust, reliable power plant capable of sustained high output under heavy load. The result was the Meteor. It offered more horsepower than any British tank engine before it, and unlike the Liberty engines, it could maintain that power across demanding terrain without overheating. But a powerful engine alone didn't solve everything. The Cromwell hull had to be redesigned to harness the Meteor's output, requiring a stronger suspension, improved cooling systems, and a transmission capable of handling far greater torque. The vehicle also needed to maintain a relatively low silhouette, a priority often noted by German gunners who found the Cromwell harder to spot at range compared to bulkier Allied tanks. The end product was still recognizably a British cruiser, but it finally possessed the mechanical reliability the Doctrine had always hoped for. This combination of a compact profile, strong engine, and agile suspension produced a tank that could accelerate faster than German crews anticipated. In Normandy, Panzer veterans accustomed to dueling slower Matildas or Churchills were suddenly confronted by a British tank that closed distances rapidly and repositioned with an energy unseen in earlier engagements. Yet the Cromwell's performance in Normandy represented only one part of its story. To see how its speed shaped real combat encounters, and why German crews sometimes found it genuinely unsettling, we must look at the specific battlefield conditions in which the Cromwell first proved what the Meteor engine could really do. When the Cromwell landed in Normandy after D-Day, its design advantages finally collided with the realities of frontline combat. Unlike the open deserts of North Africa, Normandy's terrain was a dense, restrictive maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and concealed firing positions. Many Allied tanks struggled in this environment. Shermans were reliable but tall, easily spotted, and often forced into frontal engagements against German anti-tank guns. Churchill tanks had impressive armor but moved slowly, making them vulnerable when sudden repositioning was required. German tank crews, especially those in Panzer IVs and Panthers, expected British armor to behave similarly, advancing in predictable lines of movement, carefully coordinating with infantry, and rarely maneuvering at high speed within tight spaces. The Cromwell broke these expectations almost immediately. Its Meteor engine allowed it to surge forward through gaps in the bocage, swing across open patches before a German gunner could stabilize a shot, and change direction with an agility that challenged common German assumptions about British vehicles. Panzer crews reported difficulties tracking Cromwells at medium ranges, particularly when British units used speed to bounce between hedgerows or dart across open-fire corridors. German optics were excellent, but speed-induced parallax and rapid movement across sight lines made accurate gunnery significantly harder. This was not theoretical. British reconnaissance regiments operating Cromwells, most famously the 11th Armored Division and Guards Armored Division, used high-speed maneuver as a deliberate combat method. Cromwell troops advanced quickly to seize road junctions, cover open flanks, or outflank static German positions before heavier tanks arrived. German anti-tank gunners, often relying on well-camouflaged ambush sites, found themselves forced to adjust rapidly to targets that no longer behaved like the Shermans or Churchills they had prepared for. Even in engagements where the Cromwell lacked the firepower advantage, its 75mm gun struggled against the front armor of Panthers. The vehicle's mobility allowed crews to exploit side angles, relocate after firing, or coordinate with artillery more effectively. On several occasions, Cromwell units used speed to bypass slow-moving German armor and strike supporting infantry, supply vehicles, or observation posts, creating local disruptions that German commanders later noted in after-action assessments. The Cromwell's agility also contributed to survivability. While its armor was not thick enough to endure repeated hits from high-velocity German weapons, its ability to accelerate out of danger often compensated for this limitation. Panzer crews accustomed to predictable Allied movement rhythms frequently found themselves forced to fire before fully acquiring a target, leading to premature shots or missed opportunities. By the end of the Normandy campaign, German reports consistently described British Cromwell formations as fast, difficult to track, and capable of rapid maneuver. This stood in stark contrast to early war views of British armor. The Cromwell had not rewritten tank warfare, but it had overturned German expectations, and in places like Villers-Bocage, Hill 112, and the later drive toward Belgium, its speed became a defining factor of British operational movement. But to fully appreciate why this speed mattered, we must look beyond Normandy's close terrain and examine how the Cromwell performed in the rapid breakout operations that followed, moments when mobility became not just an advantage but the centerpiece of Allied momentum across France. The Cromwell's speed reached its full expression not in the hedgerows of Normandy, but in the open-ground breakout that followed Operation Bluecoat and the subsequent Allied advance across France and Belgium. Once British and Canadian forces pushed beyond the restrictive bocage, the Cromwell became what its designers had always intended: a true exploitation tank capable of rapid thrusts, long-distance maneuver, and momentum-based tactics that forced German units to react constantly rather than dictate the tempo. During the late summer of 1944, British armored divisions often found themselves racing to secure key bridges, crossroads, and high ground before German forces could reorganize. In these rapid movements, the Cromwell excelled. Its Meteor engine allowed it to sustain high speeds across firm terrain without the overheating or mechanical failures that plagued earlier cruiser tanks. Reconnaissance regiments equipped with Cromwells became the spearhead of British advance columns, frequently reaching strategic points hours before German commanders believed any Allied armor could arrive. German accounts from this period reflect the surprise. Panzer Grenadier officers noted British tanks appearing faster than expected, sometimes emerging on flanks believed to be secure simply because Cromwell squadrons had executed long, looping maneuvers that heavier Allied tanks could not match. This acceleration of operational tempo often forced German units to abandon positions prematurely or withdraw before they could establish effective defensive lines. In an environment where mobility equaled survival, the Cromwell allowed British forces to maintain pressure in ways the Germans struggled to counterpoint. One of the most striking examples occurred during the push toward Antwerp. Cromwell-equipped reconnaissance elements covered ground so quickly that some German rear units reported being overtaken before receiving orders to withdraw. The high-speed British advances created pockets of confusion, with German troops expecting the steady, methodical pace of earlier British operations rather than the rapid movements now driven by mechanized reconnaissance. It is important to note that speed alone did not make the Cromwell invincible. Its armor remained vulnerable to the long-range guns of Panthers and Jagdpanzer IVs, and its 75mm armament required careful positioning to be effective. But the ability to choose when and where to engage, rather than being forced into predictable confrontations, gave Cromwell crews an operational flexibility that many Allied tanks lacked. The tank's speed also improved coordination with the Royal Artillery and armored infantry. Cromwell units could arrive early on key terrain, secure observation points, and call in fire support before German armor could contest the position. Panzer crews, accustomed to reacting to slower British armor, found themselves repeatedly forced into defensive engagements where the initiative had already slipped from their grasp. This expanding British mobility across the European theater laid the foundation for the Cromwell's later reputation. But its impact was not limited to 1944. To understand why its speed continued to matter, even as newer designs emerged, we must examine how the Cromwell shaped Britain's transition into the post-war armored environment, and why its mobility kept it relevant longer than many of its contemporaries. As the war drew to a close and Europe entered a new geopolitical landscape, the Cromwell's defining characteristic, its mobility, remained central to its continued service. Even as more advanced designs such as the Comet and the Centurion began to replace older British armor, the Cromwell did not disappear from frontline relevance. Instead, its speed and mechanical reliability made it valuable during the unpredictable early years of the Cold War, when NATO's armored forces were still determining how to counter a potential Soviet advance across Western Europe. Many post-war British armored units retained Cromwells because they could be rapidly deployed, repositioned, and integrated into reconnaissance or security roles without major mechanical strain. In an era when rapid reaction to Soviet movement was considered essential, a dependable high-mobility tank remained an asset. British Territorial Army units kept Cromwells operational into the early 1950s, appreciating the same qualities that had once unsettled German crews: acceleration, agility, and the ability to cover ground quickly in uncertain environments. The Cromwell's influence extended beyond British service. Several Allied nations received surplus tanks in the immediate post-war years, and their assessments echoed wartime experience. While not heavily armored, the Cromwell offered a degree of mobility that few contemporaries could match. In some armies, the Meteor-powered hull even served as a basis for training, fire support, or experimentation, reflecting a broader recognition that the Cromwell's chassis was mechanically robust and adaptable. From a historical perspective, the Cromwell's significance lies not in being the most heavily armored British tank, nor the most powerful in terms of firepower, but in transforming Britain's approach to battlefield mobility. It demonstrated first in Normandy's hedgerows, then in the open expanses of France, Belgium, and beyond, that a fast, reliable tank could reshape tactical expectations even when it faced opponents with superior armor or heavier guns. Panzer crews, who had once viewed British armor as predictable and limited, were forced to treat the Cromwell with caution simply because it could appear where and when they did not expect it. This ability to seize initiative defined the Cromwell's legacy. It proved that mobility was not merely a supporting feature but a decisive factor in armored warfare. Its speed compensated for its vulnerabilities, amplified the effectiveness of British reconnaissance tactics, and helped drive operational momentum during the critical months of 1944. And while later vehicles would surpass it in raw capability, the Cromwell's performance reoriented British armored design away from rigid cruiser versus infantry classifications and toward integrated, high-mobility platforms, an approach that would culminate in the Centurion, one of the most influential tanks of the 20th century. In the end, the reason the Cromwell shocked Panzer crews was simple. It did what British tanks had long been expected to do, but had rarely achieved. It moved with purpose, speed, and confidence, forcing German gunners and commanders to rethink how they fought. The Cromwell didn't just outrun expectations. It helped redefine them, marking a turning point in Britain's armored doctrine and leaving a legacy built not on raw power, but on the decisive advantage of mobility. If you found this exploration of Britain's Cromwell tank insightful, consider supporting the channel. A simple like helps this documentary reach more viewers, and subscribing ensures you never miss the next deep dive into the machines, decisions, and moments that shaped military history. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.